This lecture is on democratic political culture and democratization. This is somewhat of a supplement to the international relations textbook. I want to go into a little bit more depth as far as democratization goes. First of all, let's look at a spectrum of political systems from autocratic to democratic. Autocratic, rule by one; democratic, rule by the people, rule by many. Starting at this autocratic end of the spectrum, we have dictatorships where one person is in charge, whether they have inherited that role or just taken control. It could be a military dictatorship or just a monarchy type dictatorship. Monarchy is more of a family type of inherited rule, but also very authoritarian. We'll look at some examples here in a bit. A theocracy is a rule by a religious doctrine which controls society. Iran is an example of a theocracy. A single-party authoritarian system is where one party is in charge, whether or not they've been elected or not. For example, the Communist Party of China has total control of that society, and they are very secretive and hold their appointments or elections behind closed doors. Mexico had a single-party authoritarian system for over 70 years. That was such a patronage system that the single party had everything pretty much controlled all the way down to the grassroots level. And so therefore, it just perpetuated itself. An oligarchy means rule by a few, and there could be several different types of oligarchies. In the transition where the Soviet Union was coming out into the Russian system where they were looking at trying to move into a democracy, well, you had a handful of very powerful individuals, that opportunists that would come in and take charge of various sectors of the economy, kind of control the system through an oligarchy, which is now pretty much a single party authoritarian system. Plutocracy is not the rule by an alien from another planet, but this is more of a idea that of rule by money, where increasing accumulation of wealth and the power that comes with it becomes such an influence on the system that it's considered somewhat ruled by money. Now, there have been arguments that the United States could be leaning a little bit more plutocratic, in that because of the disproportionate influence of wealth and corporate influence. But the United States is considered a representative republic. The Constitution set that up, the first of its kind. It's been relatively successful, comparatively speaking, and still a fairly coveted type of system around the world, even though we're going to be talking about how there has been a detraction from democracy around the world over the past 10 or 15 years. Social democracy is where you start to see a few more socialist-leaning type elements that are trying to spread out wealth and power into the democratic aspects. So that's getting a little bit further to the end of the spectrum over here. And there's no such thing in the world, at least on the state level, of a pure democracy. That was one thing that the framers of the Constitution were very concerned about, is that having people responsible as a whole for passing policy is not what they wanted. They were afraid of the tyranny of the majority and of mob rule. If everybody was able to do that, and they could start to form factions that could swamp government. But that's the spectrum that we're looking at, and what we're going to be focusing on here is the quest for democracy around the world, as well as the difficulty of transitioning to democracy, as well as the pushback, in a way, from democracy in many places around the world. First of all, let's define the criteria or the characteristics of a democratic political culture, which is what most of the successful democratic societies in the world have that we may not necessarily just look around and be able to measure it, but we kind of take it for granted. One of the things is respect for the rule of law. And you'd think, well, duh, and that's what you're supposed to have. Well, interestingly enough, a lot of countries in the world do not have that. They have a very unstable rule of law in the first place. And in many other countries, there's no respect for that at all because of the dissension or the instability of their governmental systems. Ours was established in the Constitution, and it was the first of its kind and has become enormously influential. Probably have lost a little bit of that influence over the years, but still the earliest model of a democratic structure. Also, elections are part of this, free and fair elections, where you have universal suffrage, or as widespread suffrage is that you can agree on. Now, a lot of transitions around the world that we've seen that have tried to take place, they'll have elections, but still have a long way to go. Just because you have elections doesn't mean that you've evolved into a democratic political culture, because that does take several generations to do. And an example of that is this tolerance between subcultural elements that, even though it's not perfect, and we see flare-ups like we're seeing right now, even in the United States as far as racial tensions, but comparatively speaking, the democratic societies have figured out that coexisting, cooperating, has more long-term benefits than remaining fractured or factional or tribal, to where there's constant instability and potential for conflict. This is what we call the democratic bargain. Each group accepts that it must abide by the end result, able to get enough of what it wants, perhaps maybe getting more the next time around. May not totally agree with the end result of policy, but agreed that the people that we put in office are going to try to do that. And if we don't like it, there's avenues that we can pursue to change that aren't conflictual. So this democratic bargain is something that you can't really measure. This tolerance between subcultural elements, it just exists, and a society kind of takes that for granted, or perhaps may not realize it, because we're looking at this comparatively speaking. Right now, it may not seem like such a stable bargain at this point, but comparatively speaking, yes. And of course, a lot of this, when we say that this takes a while, generations in fact, to evolve into, that doesn't guarantee that that's the direction it's evolving into. It actually could go back the other direction if that's what we decide to do. Another thing is that the elected officials have control, civilian control, over the military and the police force. That's a very important democratic principle of separation of those types of powers. Another thing that's very hard to measure, but if it exists, it is a very important aspect of this stability. And this is the interdependence between the state, a la the government structure, and its civil society. So what we have here is something of a balance, to where people support government because we are government. We go to work for government. We run for government. We elect people to government, and then those people represent us in government, and then they pass policy that hopefully makes our lives better. But we have to balance that government support with a healthy skepticism of government, because we don't want you to abuse that power. We don't want you to get corrupt. We don't want you to take advantage of things. We want you to be held accountable, right? We want to keep an eye on you. So that's this very important balance, this interdependence that, again, very hard to measure, but it's an aspect of this stable democratic political culture. Now, here's one that we may be seeing some alternatives to. Typically, a market economy has gone somewhat hand in hand, almost like a package deal, with democratic systems. Because if you have the freedom to choose your political leaders, then that would kind of go parallel with your freedom to choose your career, choose what products you want to buy. We'll talk about China's alternative here in a minute that is a very authoritarian controlled capitalism, and they have been extremely successful as far as improving their economy and bringing over 1 billion people out of poverty. So that is something we'll talk about here in a minute, that says that, yeah, even though a market economy is a somewhat useful ingredient of this democratic political culture, that doesn't mean that a market economy cannot survive or be relatively successful under a authoritarian system. Education is something that we also probably take for granted, but it's an incredibly important part of a democratic society, that people have the opportunity to learn and gain knowledge and know what the issues are and how to understand the issues. Very important. This is what has been called a system that is anchored in these foundational principles, but floating in that, because it's a democratic system, the people ultimately choose where we go. And that's why we could go this way, we could go that way. There's no guarantee of which way we go or that we are going to progress, whatever that means. It's what we decide it's going to do. But these elements are very important as far as what makes up that democratic political culture. How did it form? Well, we've already talked about the state formation, where the powerful Western European states were the ones that kind of came together first. Homogeneous cultures then started to delegate their institutions to a defined authority. It took off. There was enormous political competition between these states, and they went out and pretty much conquered the rest of the world through colonialism. Again, what we have to do here is look at both the good and the bad. The colonial subjects, therefore, over close to 400 years of control by these Western European states, they were unable to form their own states, and these borders, for the most part, were drawn arbitrarily. So that's why there is considerable historical animosity over that instability in these regions, because they are made up of different cultural groups that do not necessarily want to coexist in some cases, or difficult to coexist because of how human beings are, that we are a very groupish species. The United States is somewhat of an exception to the norm of requiring homogeneous cultures to be able to form this. Well, no, the United States evolved as a relatively heterogeneous population, but because of these very foundational aspects that were put into place and then accepted, and then they grew roots and then became the foundation of this democratic political culture, well, then people would come here and then get acclimated to that. And then we developed our own United States of America type of culture. So we evolved despite our diversity and our multiculturalism into a democratic political culture. And two other useful examples of that are Canada and Great Britain as well. Very diverse cultures, but very, very democratic, very stable. These countries provide somewhat of an example that, yes, this can happen, that different groups can actually coexist and create the foundations of a democratic political culture and then evolve into a more stable, relatively successful society. No right, wrong, good or bad here, no guarantees of anything. What we're looking at is what has happened and why. Now let's talk about democratization and the difficulties with that. Democratization around the world has occurred in waves, and that's very typical of human behavior. When humans see something going, well, let's do that too. Now, the first wave was a long one because there was a long period in the late 1800s of elections, lots of countries establishing elections. Then there was another wave, particularly after World War II, with decolonialism and independence movements and things like that. But the third wave is considered the most dramatic and most, as far as the modern era, the most important. From 1975 to 1998, democracies in the world grew from about 25% of all the countries in the world to being free to 46% of all the countries in the world being free. So that is a pretty substantial wave towards democratization. Some of these came about due to the fatigue of authoritarian regimes. The two states that kind of sparked this wave were Spain and Greece. We'll look at some other examples here in a minute. And once people got tired of these authoritarian regimes and we started to see some rebellion, some overthrow, then there are more transitions being inspired, particularly by things such as economic crisis, international pressure. Obviously, states such as the United States have a vested interest in other states becoming democratic. We've touched on that already a little bit, but that makes rational sense that if more countries were democratic, then there would be more incentives to cooperate for mutual benefits. Human rights issues also started to come about in this period as well. More awareness of human rights and women's rights in the authoritarian regimes that were abusing their own people. So that some of the things that inspired those. Looking at some of the examples here, we don't really need to know what these processes are. But here's some examples of one-party regimes and personal reasons and military dictatorships. You see there's Spain and in Chile, for example, transitioned for internal reasons there. One-party systems such as Mexico, Hungary, in Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, military transitions such as Turkey, Brazil. Let's see, several countries here in Central South America. There's Greece, military dictatorship, which is part of what inspired it there. A racial oligarchy, the apartheid system in South Africa also started to become dismantled in the late 80s. And this group right here does not include the states that came out of the former Soviet Union. Some of those had tried to democratize in this period that we're looking at as well. So let's look at the third wave. Here it is, starting at 1975. We see there's 25% of the states in the world are what we call free countries. We'll look at how Freedom House, the NGO that studies this, and then the wave ensues, and then you can see in 1998 goes to 46%. So that's the period right there of the third wave, dramatic increase of countries in the world that are measured as free countries. But look at what has happened since then. From 1998 to 2012, it has pretty much stagnated. And then as we see here in a minute, there's actually been a retraction from democracy in the past decade or so. Freedom House, the NGO, nonprofit organization that tries to measure democracy, they look at political rights such as free, fair, competitive elections, government being accountable and open. They also look at civil liberties, freedom of expressions, freedom of association, equality, individual rights. So they look at those things and actually put a number measurement to them. The rankings are measured from a 1 to a 7. So if you're measured from 1 to 3, that's considered free, where you have these things going on: open political competition, respectful civil rights and liberties, independent civil life, and independent media, freedom of the press, obviously very important in this measurement as well. Then you look at partly free, which we're looking at around 3 to 5 being the measure where you'd be partly free. Now, even though it says partly free, look at all the negatives that are still associated with this: limited respect for political rights and liberties, frequent corruption, weak rule of law, ethnic and religious strife, single-party dominance. So that means they still have a ways to go, even though they're measured partly free. That's why we focus on the free countries here as far as making that transition. The not free, measured from 5 to 7, where basically all rights are systematically denied. Here are the graphs from the latest Freedom House report. We see that there was a general increase up until 90s there, plateaus here around 2009, and we see a little bit of a retraction here in free countries over this 10-year period. And we also see just a slight increase in countries that are measured as not free. But we'll see here in a minute that when you look at the overall aggregates, that there's been a steady decline of freedom in the world. This is the map that goes with it. And the freest countries in the world are the more developed capitalist societies. Again, we're not talking about what's right, wrong, good or bad here. We're just talking about how certain states have progressed under democratic systems compared to those that have not. We'll look at some numbers here in a minute. The countries that are measured as not free, they are quite concentrated in North and Central Africa, Middle East, and Asia. The worst countries of the bunch: Syria, one of the least free countries in the world. Ironically, South Sudan, which spent a long time, 15 years plus, in a civil war with Sudan when they were one country. Then they broke apart, and they have been mired in a civil war, an authoritarian system ever since. North Korea, no surprise there. Saudi Arabia, a relatively strong ally of the United States, but because it's a monarchy, there are very few rights there, and it's consistently ranked as one of the least free countries in the world. So even though we could say that there still remains generally a desire for democracy, particularly in these countries where the people are perhaps under the thumb of authoritarian leaderships, we also know that it is countered with a very big difficulty of making that transition. The Arab Spring uprisings that started off in 2012 are a good example of that. They were inspired by this desire for democracy, but the ensuing instability of that transition created problems. Then we started to see sectarian divides, mainly along religious lines, that created to the conflict, and certainly a mixed success. When you look at the map here, there's really only one country across this northern African wave. Again, wave behavior. We saw the wave going across North Africa into the Middle East here, and Tunisia is the only country that has been considered somewhat of a success that made a transition to democracy, and Tunisia actually won the Nobel Peace Prize a couple of years back. A lot of these other states are still considered somewhat democratic facades, to where, yes, they're holding elections, but they're still a long way off. Egypt, another strong ally of the United States, has got a military general that's still running the country there. And then several civil wars are still in place. Iraq is still dealing with terrorist elements and still fractured from the Kurds. And then some of these are just literally flat out referred to as failed states. They are just on the verge of collapse to some degree there. The desire for democracy, arguably, still out there, but the difficulty to make that transition is quite prevalent. Looking at 14 years, past 14 years, the aggregate scores from Freedom House have shown a consistent decline in democracies. As you can see, the number of countries or points that they amass here of net declines has been outnumbering since 2006. It's been outweighing the net gains in democracy. So what is happening? There's several factors that scholars have been looking at as to why there seems to be a retraction from democracy. One I've already mentioned, China's model. They are authoritarian, and it looks as though they want to stay authoritarian, even to the point of trying to suppress some of their minority groups. They want their entire country to be homogenous, and they already are fairly homogenous with the Han culture, and that kind of helps in having an authoritarian system. If everybody's on the same page culturally or ethnically, then you would be more likely to abide by what an authoritarian system wants. But the primary difference here is that their controlled capitalism has been relatively successful over the past 15, 20 years in bringing a lot of people out of poverty. So that shows that, well, yeah, we're making the right decisions for our people. Now, this is where it's going to be problematic, because if China's economy does decline or tank or go into recession, then all of these people that have been relying on the wisdom of their authoritarian leaders may start asking questions. Well, wait a minute, maybe you don't know everything of what we need to do, so maybe we should start looking at electing people. And who knows what could potentially happen in that case there. We can't read people's mind, but it looks as though China continues to want to remain authoritarian, whereas other states, such as South Korea, actually made the transition from an authoritarian system to a democratic system and showed enormous improvements as a result. There's also been the pushback, the backlash as a result of a global recession, and a lot of that has been kind of placed on this idea of globalization that we've already talked about. There have, for the past 20 years, there's been kind of a growing dissent against globalization because of the fact that it is a contributor. It's not the only thing, but it's a contributor to stagnant wages and outsourcing of jobs. And even our current president's administration ran on the platform of being somewhat anti-globalization. As a result of that, that has prevented the spread of more democratic norms. Whereas globalization, one of the primary measurable benefits from globalization is that it would increase this interdependency between states that fomented cooperation, investment, trade, and therefore more sharing of norms such as democracy. There's been a very obvious shift to authoritarianism. We've already referred to Russia and Putin's desire, which is pretty much president for life. Turkey has also turned authoritarian, in part because of trying to deal with the Kurd situation in Turkey. Venezuela, even though their leaders over the past few decades have been elected in very populist movements to get the appeal of the poor people, they have increasingly moved to an authoritarian system. Latest Freedom House report even has a pretty big article on India. India has been moving somewhat authoritarian, particularly the new administration there has been a little bit more outwardly anti-Muslim. So that would lower their freedom scores because of the less rights that might be happening to the Muslim population. Terrorism, which has made democratic countries around the world fearful, a little bit more skittish. The instability in the Middle East has created more conflict. The resulting involvement of the United States in these conflicts has not turned out all that well, which has resulted in our pullback from that. So therefore, the democratic norms are not being disseminated, you could say. The anti-immigration sentiment that's even in the United States and the European Union right now, it was the central cause for the dissension within the European Union, and the Brexit. Anti-immigration was kind of at the heart of that. And even now we have a current administration that ran on the platform of being somewhat anti-immigration. Corruption is a continuing thorn of these countries that want to transition to democracy, because when corruption exists, the transition that's a golden opportunity for opportunists that would go in there and try to take advantage of that transition, the instability. I've already touched on this, less global leadership from the democratic powers, such as the United States. We have pulled away from becoming a global influence, so therefore our democratic norms, the diffusion of those democratic norms are the example that we set as a democratic state, are not the same as they were. The sustainability of democracy is difficult. Democracy is more difficult to sustain than authoritarian system. Authoritarian leaders don't have to be held accountable. They can do whatever they want. That's the reason why they're authoritarian. They can do whatever they want and not be held accountable. Democracy, not only are they held accountable, but this openness, particularly in this transition to try to get to a democracy, this openness unleashes all of these factional and regional nationalist pressures. Everybody now is coming to the fore, and we want a part of this. We want say in this. We want equal representation in this. So if there's difficulty there between these groups to coexist, well, then that's going to start potentially to flare up during this transition. Now, the transition to democracy is more likely to be successful when it's preceded by a slow liberalization of things before you make that shift to elections. And this includes starting the transitions, the legal maneuvers for separation of powers to bestow individual rights and to start the idea of representation. And this is another example of where South Korea did this and was relatively successful, whereas looking at Russia, it was literally called cold turkey the way they tried to make the transition, and it was very unstable to the point where people were not happy with it. And then when an authoritarian such as Putin was elected, took back control, and that's why Putin was relatively popular for a long time, because he restored a little bit of the old style Soviet stability. Backsliding back from democracy is a potential if the economy doesn't improve, which makes sense there, because if you make this transition and you start to see, well, wait a minute, it's not making things any better for us, so what's the point? However, democracies do have a significantly higher GDP per capita than non-democracies, and this has been a historical measurement that democracies are better at fostering economic growth. They're held more accountable, and they have to make their economies more inclusive. They have to get more people involved in the economy to spread that wealth, to improve that revenue and the jobs and the prosperity all around. And then if more people are working and happy, then they get reelected. So it kind of feeds on itself as to why democracies are more prosperous on average than authoritarian systems. And the reasons for becoming a democracy, however, have less to do with this economic prosperity than they do with freedom. The general tendency is for people to want more freedom, individual rights, property rights, less powerful government, less autocratic governments that are keeping them from fully enjoying life. They want that first. And then the assumption is that now that we can pick our leaders and they are going to be held accountable, then the economy will start to be more inclusive as well, and that will hopefully follow. And once becoming a democracy, as I've already alluded to, it's more likely to remain if that prosperity does increase. And economic and democratic scholars have actually put dollar numbers on there to see that on average, if the GDP per capita improves to this much, they have a much higher chance of staying. Now let's just look at some maps here and charts and graphs. We are looking here that in general, as the further you get to being a more of a democracy, we see the trend also goes up here. And as you become less of a democracy, keep in mind that states like Qatar, which are not democratic at all, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, they are all oil wealth driven countries. So those are exceptions to this theory here that they have the luck of oil resources on their territory and they are incredibly wealthy as far as that goes, but very authoritarian as well. But in general, we see a clear trend. This is the long-term trend for over the past 500 years. This study shows that there's a significant trend in increasing GDP per capita amongst states that are going democratic. This is the GDP per capita map. Kind of correlates with the freedom map that we saw a little while ago. The more free countries have a higher GDP per capita. It's almost a direct correlation. And the poorest countries of the world, almost a direct correlation here. They're also the less free countries in the world. The global north-south divide was deemed that way because the Western European states and the United States were congregated in the northern hemisphere, and most of the poor countries were in the southern hemisphere, and that's where that north-south divide came from. Today, we pretty much just call it rich versus poor, but this shows the predominance over time of states below a certain latitude there, and this is not below the equator. This is below the tropics there at 30 degrees latitude. So it's not a pure north-south divide on the equator anyway. Another interesting correlation is that the richest countries in the world, the government is more involved in expenditures for the society. Looking here of the states that have the highest government expenditures per capita, well, again, it's another direct correlation. The richest countries in the world also show that their governments are more actively involved in spending on infrastructure and education and security in order to support their civil society, and that they become a more inclusive economy. The poorest states in the world, no surprise here, also have the least government involvement in their societies in terms of government expenditures. What do we equate between democracy and prosperity? Now, this has become somewhat of a point of contention that capitalism and globalization, which has been, we've already talked about that as being equated to global capitalism, that democracy is somewhat of a package deal with that, comes with it hand in hand. However, we're seeing examples of non-democratic market economies, and that could be emboldening authoritarian leaders to say, well, we can still have a good economy and still be a non-democratic state. So we could be seeing that. And there's also the continuing claims against the Western ideals. Unfortunately, the Western European states dominated the rest of the world and created a huge rich versus poor divide during the era of colonialism. And those claims that, particularly of poor states, whether it's in Africa or in the Middle East or Asia, that these Western powers are trying to force this Western style capitalism on us of consumerism and materialism. And yes, some of that does hold up because the rich countries of the world got there first and they want to create a global economy that's going to work for them as well as provide mutual benefits. We'll be talking in a lot more detail about the global economy. But we also have to keep in mind is that Western societies that got there first and became successful and very prosperous, the Western societies have been good at providing things that human beings want. And if it's something that makes your life easier or makes your life more fun, well, that's what other human beings are going to want as well. Regardless of who got there first, that looks like a good idea. Despite a lot of these authoritarian non-democratic or anti-capitalist leaders pushing back against Western values, well, they are most certainly willing to accept all the luxuries that a prosperous society can provide. Looking at the democratic peace theory, probably touched on this once before already, and that is the theory that is still holding up, that democracies do not go to war with each other. It's been studied for the past several decades. They went all the way back to the first democracies, including the United States, back in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and they have not been able to find a situation where two democracies that were measured as democratic at that time have gone to war with each other. So it's an interesting concept that still holds up today. There's more incentive for democracies not to go to war because their leaders are held accountable. They don't want to lose a war. And if both sides have those same restraints and accountabilities, well, then that's a less likelihood for them to go to war with each other. So it works both ways to prevent them from going to war with each other. The United States, however, has been most at war since 1945 with non-democracies, and I don't think there's any argument that some of the motivations for those wars were try to get rid of authoritarian regimes and hopefully establish democracies that we can then deal with in the future. And the idea of a world full of democracies is intriguing as long as this theory continues to hold up. The transition, as I've said before, the transition to a democracy can unleash violence. But once the transition is made, we've also been able to see that democracies commit less violence on their own citizens. This process of democratization has been slowing down. It's also very difficult to adopt or sustain without a political culture. So one feeds on the other. Once you establish the foundations of the political culture, that then has to evolve over many generations in order to develop a stable democratic political culture. And there are many countries in the world where that has not even started yet. As I mentioned before, once this transition is made and this evolution, this progress tries to maintain itself, it's more likely to sustain with economic development. And then the evidence does show that if they do sustain and become democracies, the economic differences are significant. Forced wars, I kind of alluded to that a minute ago, forced wars to try to get rid of non-democratic regimes with the hopes of establishing democratic systems. They have not had a high rate of success. Another thing is that when Muslims are polled, for example, they do feel that a system of democracy could work, but there's not a large support for a U.S. style of democracy. So that's where these cultures are going to have to figure it out for themselves, for the most part, of what kind of system that can we create that starts to evolve into a stable system where cultural groups, ethnic groups, religious groups can then figure out how to coexist and sustain themselves. And what we're seeing now today is more of a trend towards what we might call a modern authoritarianism, where it's becoming more accepted to be an authoritarian system and a controlled capitalism that could still bring you some economic progress. So this is the lecture on democratization that I wanted to touch on as somewhat of a supplement from the textbook, going into a little bit more depth on this idea of a democratic political culture and the difficulty of democratization.